I woke up from a coma and my wife said, "You're not my husband." The fluorescent lights hurt my eyes when they finally opened. Everything was white and blurred, shapes moving at the periphery of my vision like ghosts. I tried to speak but couldn't, my throat raw and constricted around something plastic. A tube. I was intubated. My fingers twitched against starched sheets, and somewhere nearby, a machine beeped in steady rhythm with my heartbeat. A face appeared above me, a woman in blue scrubs with kind eyes. "Mr. Holloway, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you understand." I squeezed weakly, my hand feeling like it belonged to someone else. She smiled and turned to call someone, and then there were more people, more voices, hands touching me professionally, checking pupils and reflexes and vital signs. They removed the breathing tube an hour later, and I coughed until my ribs ached, each breath burning its way down my throat. The doctor, a man with gray temples and wire-rimmed glasses, explained that I'd been in a medically induced coma for 3 weeks following a severe car accident. Traumatic brain injury, fractured skull, internal bleeding. They'd kept me under while the swelling in my brain reduced, while my body fought to heal itself. "You're very lucky to be alive, Thomas," he said. And I wanted to laugh because I didn't feel lucky. I felt hollow and confused. My memories fragmented like a broken mirror where pieces were missing and others reflected things I couldn't quite grasp. "Where's Natalie?" I managed to croak, my voice barely recognizable. "My wife." I needed to see my wife. The doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse, something passing between them that made my stomach clench with sudden fear. "She's been notified that you're awake. She's on her way." His tone was carefully neutral, professionally reassuring, but I caught the hesitation underneath. Something was wrong. I tried to sit up, but my body wouldn't cooperate, muscles weak and unresponsive from 3 weeks of disuse. They adjusted my bed instead, raising me to a semi-reclined position, and I waited, watching the door with growing anxiety that had no rational explanation. Natalie arrived 20 minutes later, and the moment she stepped through the door, I knew something fundamental had shifted. She stopped just inside the room, her hand still on the doorframe, staring at me with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. Not relief or joy, or even the tears I'd expected. Fear. Real, genuine, gut-deep fear that made her face go pale and her body tense like she was preparing to run. "Natalie?" I said, reaching toward her with my IV-tethered hand. "It's okay. I'm okay. I'm awake." But she didn't move closer. If anything, she took a small step backward, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Who are you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, shaking with something that sounded like horror. I tried to smile, thinking it was shock, that she just needed a moment to process seeing me conscious after weeks of uncertainty. "It's me. It's Thomas. I know I probably look different, but it's me, sweetheart." She shook her head slowly, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. No, you're not. You're not Thomas." The words hit me like a physical blow, confusion and hurt warring in my chest. The nurse moved toward Natalie, speaking in low, soothing tones about shock and trauma and giving her time, but Natalie was backing toward the door now, shaking her head more violently. "Thomas died," she said, her voice rising. "He died 3 weeks ago. I was there. I held his hand when they turned off the machines. I planned his funeral. I buried my husband." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but she still wouldn't come near me. "Whoever you are, whatever this is, you're not him. You can't be him." The doctor stepped in, gently guiding Natalie to a chair in the hallway, while another staff member ushered her out. I sat frozen in the hospital bed, my mind reeling. What was she talking about? I'd been in a coma, not dead. They just said I was lucky to be alive. Why would she think I'd died? Dr. Harrison, the neurologist who'd been overseeing my care, came back into the room with an expression of deep concern. "Thomas, I need to ask you some questions. Can you tell me your full name?" I recited it automatically. "Thomas Edward Holloway." He nodded, making notes. "Your birth date?" I gave it. "Your wife's name?" "Natalie Ann Holloway. Maiden name Westbrook. We got married 6 years ago at that vineyard in Napa Valley." I could see the ceremony in my mind. Natalie in her white dress, the golden light of late afternoon, the way she'd laughed when I nearly dropped the ring. Dr. Harrison was watching me carefully. "What's the last thing you remember before the accident?" I closed my eyes, trying to pull the memories forward through the fog. I was driving home from work. It was raining. There was construction on Highway 101, so I took the detour through the canyon. And then I paused, frustrated by the blank space where memory should be. Nothing. I don't remember the accident itself. He nodded like he'd expected that. That's normal with head trauma. The brain often doesn't retain memories of the actual traumatic event. "Thomas, do you remember what day it is?" I didn't. The knowledge sat just out of reach, slippery and uncertain. "Friday?" I guessed, though I had no real sense of it. "It's Monday, March 14th. You were in your accident on February 22nd. That was a Wednesday evening around 6 p.m. You've been unconscious for 20 days. 20 days. 3 weeks of my life just gone. But that still didn't explain Natalie's reaction, her claim that I died. Why does my wife think I'm dead? What happened?" Dr. Harrison sat down in the chair beside my bed, his expression grave. "I need to make some calls and verify some information before we discuss this further. For now, I want you to rest and let your body continue healing. We'll have answers soon. But I couldn't rest. My mind spun in circles, anxiety building with each passing hour. The nurses checked on me regularly, their professional cheerfulness now tinged with something else. Pity maybe, or uncertainty. No one would tell me anything concrete. Natalie didn't return, though I heard her voice once in the hallway, talking urgently with someone, the words muffled but the tone desperate. I tried to call out to her, but by the time a nurse came to check what I needed, she was gone. That absence hurt more than any of my physical injuries, a hollow ache in my chest that had nothing to do with broken ribs. Evening came, the hospital settling into its nighttime rhythm. I dozed fitfully, waking repeatedly from dreams that felt wrong somehow, memories that didn't quite fit together. In one, I was at home in our kitchen, making coffee while Natalie read the newspaper at the table. But when I looked closer, the kitchen was different. The appliances were newer, the layout slightly altered. In another, I was at work in my office, but my nameplate said something else, a name that felt familiar and foreign at the same time. Each time I woke, I felt more disoriented, like I was grasping at smoke. Dr. Harrison returned early the next morning with Detective Linda Reeves from the County Sheriff's Department and a woman he introduced as Dr. Patricia Keene, a psychiatrist. The detective was in her 40s, with sharp eyes that assessed me clinically as she took the seat beside my bed. Mr. Holloway, I'm going to show you something, and I need you to look at it carefully and tell me if you recognize this person. She pulled out a tablet and turned it toward me, showing me a driver's license photo. The man in the picture looked similar to me, but not quite right. Same general features, but his hair was different, styled differently, and his face was slightly fuller. That's not me, I said immediately. It looks like me, but it's not. Detective Reeves nodded slowly. This is Thomas Edward Holloway, born July 12, 1985 in Sacramento, California. Married to Natalie Ann Westbrook in 2017 at a vineyard in Napa Valley. Employed as an architect at Morrison and Associates in San Francisco. Resident of 428 Cypress Lane in Mill Valley. Every detail she listed was correct, matched what I knew to be true about my life. But that photo wasn't me. I don't understand, I said, my voice cracking. That's my information, my life, but that's not my face. Or, it is, but different. I don't know how to explain it. Dr. Keene leaned forward. Thomas, what if I told you that the man in this photo died 3 weeks ago? That he was in a severe car accident on Highway 101, was brought to this hospital, and passed away 2 days later from his injuries. His wife, Natalie Holloway, identified his body. She made funeral arrangements. There was a memorial service attended by over 100 people. He was cremated last week. My heart was pounding now, each beat painful against my bruised ribs. But I didn't die. I'm right here. I'm Thomas Holloway. I have all his memories, his life, everything. Detective Reeves pulled out another photo, this one showing me as I looked now, taken while I was unconscious. This is you. You were brought to this hospital the same night as Thomas Holloway, from a separate accident about 15 miles away on Route 35 through the canyon. You had no identification on you, no wallet, no phone, nothing. You were listed as a John Doe for the first week until we could run your fingerprints. And that's where things get complicated. She paused, letting that sink in. Your fingerprints match a man named Daniel Morrison, who disappeared from Seattle 7 years ago. The name hit me like a thunderclap, familiar and terrifying in equal measure. Daniel Morrison. I knew that name. It was mine. Or it had been. But that was wrong, wasn't it? I was Thomas Holloway. I had Thomas's memories, his wife, his life. I don't understand what you're telling me, I said, though part of me was beginning to understand. And that understanding was fracturing something fundamental in my sense of self. Dr. Keene spoke gently. We believe you may have what's called dissociative fugue, triggered or intensified by your head trauma. It's a rare condition where a person essentially adopts a new identity, sometimes completely forgetting their previous life. Combined with your physical resemblance to Thomas Holloway, it's possible you've been living as him, believing you are him. No, I shook my head, ignoring the pain the movement caused. I remember being Thomas. I remember my childhood, my parents, growing up in Sacramento. I remember college at Berkeley, meeting Natalie at a coffee shop when I was 25. I remember our first date, our wedding, buying our house. I remember working on the Henderson project last month, the client meetings, the design revisions. These aren't false memories, they're real. But even as I said it, doubt was creeping in, because I also remembered other things, glimpses of a different life. An apartment in Seattle, a woman named Rebecca, a job at a different firm, a father who died when I was 16, not the father I remembered Thomas having who was still alive. Detective Reeves pulled out more documents. Daniel Morrison was reported missing by his girlfriend, Rebecca Chan, on March 3, 2017. He left their apartment one morning saying he was going to work and never came back. His car was found abandoned at a park 3 days later. There was a massive search, but no trace of him was ever found. The case went cold after 6 months. She showed me a photo from the missing persons report. The man looked exactly like me, or how I looked now in the hospital bed. This is you, Daniel Morrison, 32 years old when you disappeared. You would be 39 now. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't make them stop. But Thomas Holloway is also 39. We're the same age. If I disappeared 7 years ago and Thomas has been living his life this whole time, how can I have his memories? Dr. Keene exchanged a look with Dr. Harrison before speaking. We don't have all the answers yet, but we have a theory. Thomas Holloway and Daniel Morrison were physically similar enough to be mistaken for each other, especially after both sustained significant facial trauma in your respective accidents. When you woke up from your coma, your brain, already compromised by the fugue state and now further damaged by head trauma, latched on to the identity of the man whose life had just ended, the man who looked like you, the man whose wife has been here every day, sitting by a bedside. But she was sitting by his bedside, not mine, I said, grasping for logic in this nightmare. Detective Reeves nodded. Yes, but the hospital is investigating a terrible error. You were both here at the same time, both in similar conditions. Thomas Holloway was in room 412. You were in room 414, right next door. When Thomas died on February 24th, his body was taken to the morgue. You remained in your induced coma in 414. But there may have been confusion in the records, especially during a shift change. The wrong patient bracelet may have been placed on you. We're still investigating exactly what happened. The implications were staggering. They were telling me I'd somehow stolen a dead man's identity. Not intentionally, but through a combination of medical error and psychological breakdown. That I'd been living as Thomas Holloway for years, maybe since my disappearance in 2017. That everything I remembered, everything I believed about myself, was a delusion built on fragments of two different lives tangled together. This is insane, I whispered. I'm not crazy. I know who I am. But did I? The memories were starting to separate now. Two streams of experience that I'd somehow merged into one coherent narrative. Thomas growing up in Sacramento with two siblings. Daniel growing up in Portland as an only child. Thomas studying architecture at Berkeley. Daniel studying the same subject at University of Washington. Both meeting women named with N names, Natalie and Nicole? No, Rebecca. Both working at firms, getting engaged, building lives. Dr. Harrison spoke for the first time in several minutes. Thomas, or Daniel, whoever you are right now, your brain is trying to integrate two sets of experiences. The fugue state you entered 7 years ago allowed you to essentially become someone else, possibly as he escaped from trauma or stress in your original life. You adopted Thomas Holloway's identity, or a version of it. You may have been stalking him, studying him, learning his life. When your paths converged in this hospital and he died while you survived, the psychological merger became complete in your mind. His words made me feel sick. The fluorescent lights suddenly too bright, the room too small. Am I under arrest? I asked the detective, my voice hollow. She shook her head. Not at this time. You haven't committed a crime that we can prove. If you genuinely believed you were Thomas Holloway, if the fugue state is real, then you weren't acting with criminal intent. But we need to sort out the truth. We need to contact Rebecca Chan and see if she can identify you. We need to investigate how you came to be living Thomas Holloway's life. And we need to inform Natalie Holloway that the man she buried may not have been her husband. That last part felt like a knife twisting. Natalie had buried someone she thought was me, was Thomas. But what if it had been? What if I was actually Daniel? Delusional and broken, and Thomas really was dead. Rebecca arrived 2 days later. I watched through the window in my hospital room door as Detective Reeves spoke with her in the hallway. She was petite, Asian, in her late 30s, wearing a professional blazer and carrying herself with careful composure. When the detective gestured toward my room, Rebecca turned to look, and even through the window I saw her face go white. She put her hand against the wall to steady herself, and for a long moment, she just stared. Then she was walking toward the room, and the nurse was opening the door, and she stood in the doorway exactly as Natalie had, except her expression was completely different. Recognition, relief, and rage. Daniel? Her voice broke on the name. Is it really you? I looked at her and felt something shift in my mind. Like a door opening onto memories I'd locked away. This woman, I knew her. Not from Thomas's life, but from before. An apartment with hardwood floors and too much sunlight in the morning. Coffee brewing while she got ready for work. Arguments about money, about commitment, about my inability to make decisions about our future. Rebecca, I said, and the name felt right in a way Natalie's never had, even though I'd said it thousands of times in my merged memories. She came closer, tears streaming down her face now. Where have you been? Do you have any idea what you put me through? 7 years, Daniel. 7 years of not knowing if you were alive or dead, if you'd left me, or if something terrible had happened. I filed missing persons reports. I hired a private investigator. I called every hospital and morgue in 3 states. And you were just, what? Living a different life? Pretending to be someone else? Her anger was justified, painful to witness. I had no answers for her because I didn't remember leaving. In my mind, I'd always been Thomas. But looking at Rebecca, I remembered fragments of Daniel's life. Our apartment, her laugh, the way she'd bite her lower lip when she was thinking. The fight we'd had the morning before I disappeared, about me refusing to set a wedding date, about my inability to commit to anything permanent. Dr. Keene entered the room with Dr. Harrison and Detective Reeves. Ms. Chan, we need to ask you some questions about Daniel. specifically about his mental state before he disappeared. Had he exhibited any signs of dissociation, memory problems, or psychological distress? Rebecca wiped her eyes and nodded. He'd been acting strange for months before he left. Distant, distracted. He'd forget conversations we'd just had. Sometimes he'd come home from work and not remember how he got there. I wanted him to see a therapist, but he kept saying he was fine, just stressed about a big project. She looked at me. You were working on the Holloway building downtown. It was a major commission for your firm. You were obsessed with it, working late every night, barely sleeping. The Holloway building. The name triggered something, a cascade of memories that didn't belong to Thomas's life. I'd been designing a residential tower in Seattle. The client was Thomas Holloway, a wealthy developer who'd commissioned the building. I'd met with him dozens of times, studied his requirements, his aesthetic preferences, his life story to better understand what he wanted in the design. We'd looked similar. People had commented on it. Like brothers, someone had joked. And then one day, after a particularly long night at the office, I'd driven home and taken a wrong turn. I'd ended up at his house instead of my apartment. I'd sat in my car outside his beautiful home in the suburbs, watching through the windows as he lived the life I wanted. Married, successful, settled. Everything I was too afraid to achieve. Oh God, I whispered, as the memories surfaced fully. I had stalked him, not violently, not with intent to harm, but I'd followed Thomas Holloway, learned his routines, studied his life like a blueprint I could follow. And at some point, in my deteriorating mental state, I'd crossed a line I didn't even remember crossing. I'd started believing I was him. When he went on a business trip, I'd gone to his house, told his wife Natalie that I'd come home early. She'd noticed something was off, that I seemed different, but I'd convinced her it was stress from the project. And then I'd just stayed, slipped into his life while he was gone. When the real Thomas returned, had we confronted each other? Had something happened that I couldn't remember? Detective Reeves was watching my face, seeing the realization dawn. You remember something? It wasn't a question. I told them everything that was coming back, the fragments assembling into a horrifying narrative. The obsession, the stalking, the identity theft. But I don't remember what happened when Thomas came back. There's a gap, like static in my memory, and I don't remember 7 years. If I've been living as him for 7 years, where was the real Thomas? The detective's expression was grim. That's what we need to find out. Because if Thomas Holloway was missing for 7 years and only recently returned to reclaim his life, that changes everything about this case. They brought in specialists, more psychiatrists, neurologists, a forensic psychologist. I underwent battery after battery of tests, cognitive evaluations, memory assessments. The diagnosis was eventually confirmed. Dissociative fugue with psychotic features, triggered by extreme stress and manifesting as delusional misidentification. I'd created an elaborate false identity by merging my own memories with information I'd gathered about Thomas Holloway. The head trauma from my recent accident had further scrambled the memories, making it impossible for my brain to distinguish between what I'd lived and what I'd invented or appropriated from Thomas's life. But the crucial question remained, where had Thomas Holloway been for 7 years? Detective Reeves led the investigation, digging into records, interviewing people from both Daniel Morrison's life and Thomas Holloway's. What they uncovered was stranger than anyone had anticipated. Thomas Holloway had reported a break-in at his home in March 2017, right around the time I'd disappeared from Seattle. He'd called the police saying someone had been living in his house while he was on a business trip, personal items moved, food eaten, even his bed slept in. The police had investigated, but found no evidence of forced entry, and with nothing stolen, they'd filed it as a possible misunderstanding or prank. Shortly after that incident, Thomas had started acting strangely according to his friends and colleagues. He'd become paranoid, claiming someone was trying to steal his identity. He'd changed all his passwords, his phone number, even considered selling his house and moving. His wife Natalie had been concerned, thought he was having a breakdown from work stress. Then one day, in April 2017, Thomas had left for what he said was a business trip and never come back. He'd sent Natalie a few text messages over the following weeks saying he needed time to think, that he was dealing with some personal issues. Then the messages stopped. Natalie had filed a missing person report after a month, but with no evidence of foul play and the prior messages suggesting he'd left voluntarily, the investigation had gone nowhere. Thomas Holloway had been missing for nearly 7 years, and during that time, I had been living his life. The evidence was overwhelming once they started looking. Dental records confirmed that the man who died in the car accident 3 weeks ago was indeed Thomas Edward Holloway. His fingerprints matched records on file. DNA from his body matched DNA from items in his home. He was real. He had existed, and he had died while I survived. But what had happened during those 7 years he was gone? Where had he been while I lived in his house, slept with his wife, worked at his job? Natalie was brought in for questioning, her grief now complicated by betrayal and confusion. She'd been married to me, thinking I was Thomas, for 7 years. She'd shared her life, her bed, her future with a stranger. He was different when he came back from that business trip. she told the detective while I listened from another room. More attentive, more present. He'd been so distant before, so consumed with work. But after he came back, it was like he'd had an epiphany about what mattered. He was loving, affectionate, committed. I thought we'd turned a corner in our marriage. I thought I'd finally gotten my husband back. She started crying, but it wasn't him. It was never him, and I didn't know. How could I not know? The forensic investigation revealed something that made the case even more disturbing. When they examined Thomas's car from the recent accident, they found evidence in the trunk. Personal items belonging to Thomas, a duffel bag with clothes, toiletries, a laptop, and most chillingly, a journal. Detective Reeves brought me excerpts from it, her face unreadable as she read Thomas's entries. March 18th, 2017. There's someone in my house. I know it sounds crazy, but I can feel it. Things are moved. My routines are different. Natalie looks at me strangely. April 2nd, 2017. I can't go home. He's there, the man who looks like me. I saw him through the window, kissing my wife. I don't know what to do. If I call the police, will they believe me? Will Natalie? The entries continued, documenting Thomas's descent into a desperate fugitive existence. He'd been afraid to confront me directly, worried that with our similar appearances, any confrontation might make him look like the crazy one. He'd watched his own life from a distance, seeing me live it, unable to reclaim it. He'd stayed in motels, lived out of his car, worked odd jobs under the table. For 7 years, he'd been homeless in spirit, if not in fact, displaced from his own existence by a doppelganger he couldn't explain or fight. The final entry is dated February 22nd, Detective Reeves said quietly. The day of the accidents. He wrote, I saw him today, driving my car, living my life. I followed him. I'm going to make him tell the truth. I'm going to get my life back. Whatever it takes. The reconstruction was damning. Thomas had followed me that rainy evening, tracking me through the canyon. In his journal, he'd described his plan, confront me, force me to admit to Natalie and the police what I'd done, reclaim his identity. But something had gone wrong on those wet, winding roads. Had there been a confrontation that led to my accident? Had Thomas tried to force me off the road? Or had it been simpler, crueler? Two similar men driving similar routes in dangerous conditions, and fate choosing that moment to intervene. Thomas's car had crashed first, on Highway 101. Mine had crashed minutes later on Route 35. We'd both been brought to the same hospital. Two men who looked alike, both named on documents that got confused in the chaos of the emergency room. The hospital administration was now under investigation for the errors that had compounded this tragedy. The wrong bracelet placement, the record confusion, the fact that no one had questioned why there were two men with such similar appearances and overlapping information. When Thomas died and I woke up, the mix-up had seemed to resolve itself in the most terrible way. His wife had identified a body she believed was her husband. I had woken up believing I was him, and the truth had died with Thomas in that morgue, cremated before anyone realized the magnitude of the mistake. Natalie refused to see me again after learning the truth. I didn't blame her. The man she'd loved for 7 years had been a ghost, a stranger wearing her husband's life like a costume. The real Thomas had been out there the whole time, alone and desperate, watching his life be stolen while unable to reclaim it. She'd mourned him, buried him, and now had to mourn him again, this time knowing he'd spent his final years in exile because of me. The guilt was overwhelming, crushing. I had destroyed a man's life without even knowing I was doing it. My broken mind unable to distinguish between reality and delusion. Rebecca came to see me regularly during my recovery, though our conversations were strained and painful. I don't know if I can forgive you, she said one afternoon, sitting in the chair beside my bed. You didn't just leave me. You stole someone else's entire life. You made a woman fall in love with a lie. You let a man suffer for years. I had no defense, because she was right. I don't remember choosing any of it, I said, my voice hoarse. But that doesn't matter, does it? The damage is done regardless of my intent. She looked at me with eyes that held no warmth. No, it doesn't matter. Intent doesn't erase harm. The legal proceedings were complex. The district attorney struggled with how to charge someone who'd committed identity theft while genuinely believing they were that person. The psychiatric evaluation supported the diagnosis of dissociative fugue, a recognized mental health condition. I hadn't acted with criminal intent because I hadn't believed I was acting at all. I thought I was simply living my own life, but the consequences of my actions were undeniable. Thomas Holloway had lost 7 years, his marriage, and ultimately his life. Natalie had been deceived. Rebecca had suffered years of uncertainty. The hospital had made critical errors. Someone needed to be held accountable. In the end, I was placed in a secure psychiatric facility for an indefinite period. Not prison, but not freedom either. A place where I could receive treatment for the dissociative disorder, where doctors could try to untangle the remaining confusions in my memory, where I could be monitored to ensure I posed no further risk to myself or others. I accepted the placement without argument. Where else could I go? I had no home, no identity I could claim without causing pain. Daniel Morrison's apartment had been rented to someone else years ago. Thomas Holloway's house was Natalie's, and she was selling it, unable to bear living in the space where she'd unknowingly shared her life with an imposter. Dr. Keene visited me weekly at the facility, working through my memories, helping me separate what was real from what I'd constructed. It was like untangling two strings that had been wound together so tightly they'd become one, each strand stained with the color of the other. Some memories were clearly mine. Growing up in Portland, my father's death when I was 16, Rebecca's apartment in Seattle. Others were clearly appropriated. Thomas's childhood in Sacramento, his college years at Berkeley, his wedding to Natalie. But many were somewhere in between. My experiences merged with his details, creating a hybrid life that had never actually existed. The human mind is remarkably good at creating coherent narratives, Dr. Keene explained during one session. When faced with gaps or contradictions, it fills them in, smooths them over, makes everything fit. You needed to escape Daniel Morrison's life for reasons we're still exploring. You found Thomas Holloway, someone who represented what you wanted to be, and your mind created a bridge. Over time, that bridge became the only road you could remember walking. I asked the question that haunted me most. Did I kill him? Not directly, but did my actions lead to his death? She considered before answering. Thomas made the choice to follow you that night. He'd been following his own life for 7 years, unable to reclaim it, but unable to let it go. The accidents were separate events, according to the accident reconstruction. You didn't cause his crash, but yes, your actions set in motion the circumstances that led to his death. That's a burden you'll carry. Natalie filed a lawsuit against the hospital for the errors that had allowed this situation to spiral. The hospital settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. Several staff members were terminated, and new protocols were implemented to prevent similar identity confusions. It was cold comfort for a woman who'd lost her husband twice, once to theft and once to death. She started a foundation in Thomas's name to help families dealing with identity-related crimes and to advocate for better mental health screening and intervention. Through that work, she found a kind of peace, transforming her grief into action. Rebecca moved on with her life, eventually starting a relationship with someone new. She came to see me one final time before moving out of state, wanting closure. "I've spent a lot of time being angry," she said, standing near the door of my room at the facility, not coming closer. "Angry at you for leaving, angry at myself for not seeing how sick you were, angry at a system that let you slip through the cracks until you destroyed someone else's life. But I've realized the anger was keeping me trapped. I need to let you go, Daniel. Whoever you were, whoever you became, you're not someone I can carry with me anymore." I told her I understood, that I was glad she'd found a way forward. After she left, I sat in my room and felt the finality of that goodbye. The last thread connecting me to my original life severed. The months in the facility stretched into a year, then 2. I made progress in treatment, though Dr. Keene warned me that dissociative tendencies could recur under stress. I'd always have to be vigilant, aware of the gaps in my consciousness, the moments when reality felt slippery. I'd always have to question my memories, verify my experiences, anchor myself to documentation, rather than relying on my unreliable mind. It was exhausting, this constant self-surveillance, but it was necessary. I'd proven what could happen when I trusted my perceptions without verification. The facility eventually transitioned me to supervised outpatient care. I moved into a monitored apartment, reported to therapy 3 times a week, took medication that helped stabilize my moods and reduce dissociative symptoms. I got a job doing technical work for an architecture firm, nothing creative or high level, just drafting and rendering based on other people's designs. It was safer that way, keeping me away from the intense projects that had triggered my initial breakdown. I kept to myself, didn't form close relationships, and lived a small, controlled life that felt like penance. 5 years after waking up in that hospital bed, I received a letter forwarded through my attorney. It was from Natalie. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it, unsure if I could handle whatever she needed to say. Inside was a single page, her handwriting careful and measured. "Daniel, I've spent years trying to understand what happened, to make sense of how I could have loved a stranger and not known it. My therapist tells me you showed me what I wanted to see, that you reflected Thomas back at me in ways that made me believe my marriage had improved. Maybe that's true. Maybe I was complicit in the deception because it gave me the husband I'd always wanted. I'll never know for sure. What I do know is that Thomas spent 7 years alone because of you, and that's unforgivable. But I also know you were sick, and that the system failed all of us. I'm not writing to offer forgiveness. I'm writing to tell you that I've chosen to remember the good parts of those 7 years, the moments of genuine connection, even though they were built on lies. Not because you deserve that grace, but because I deserve to keep something from that time that wasn't just pain. I hope you've found a way to live with what you've done. Thomas never got that chance." I read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in a box with the few possessions I'd accumulated. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement, a recognition that the situation had been more complex than simple villainy. I'd been sick, truly sick, in a way that had caused immeasurable harm. That didn't excuse it, but it did contextualize it. And context, I'd learned, was sometimes all you could hope for when redemption was impossible. Years passed. I stayed in treatment, stayed vigilant, stayed small. I watched Rebecca's life unfold through occasional internet searches, saw her get married, have children, build the future she'd once wanted with me. I followed Natalie's foundation work from a distance, saw her transform grief into advocacy, helping others navigate the intersection of mental illness and criminal justice. Both women had survived what I'd done to them and built meaningful lives from the wreckage. That was more than I deserved. I thought about Thomas constantly, the man whose life I'd stolen and whose death I'd inadvertently caused. In my clearer moments, I could see him as a separate person, with his own history and personality and rights. In my worst moments, the memories still tangled together, and I had to actively work to remind myself which experiences were actually mine. The journal he'd kept during his exile had been given to Natalie, but excerpts had been released to the media during the legal proceedings. Reading his words, his fear and frustration and desperate hope that he could somehow reclaim what was his was a unique kind of torture. He'd been so close, watching his life through windows, unable to reach through the glass. And then, on that rainy night 7 years after it all began, he'd tried one final time to take back what was his, and it had killed him. I never stopped wondering what would have happened if I'd gotten help in those first months when I felt reality starting to slip. If Rebecca had insisted instead of suggesting. If my employer had noticed the warning signs. If Thomas had confronted me immediately instead of retreating in fear and confusion. Would he still be alive? Would I have found treatment before causing such irreparable harm? The what-ifs were pointless but unavoidable. Alternate timelines where everyone survived and no one's life was destroyed. But those timelines didn't exist. This one did, with all its damage and consequences and scars that would never fully heal. I woke up from a coma, and my wife said I wasn't her husband. She was right. I was never anyone's husband. I was a thief who'd stolen a life and destroyed the man who'd lived it, and no amount of mental illness could change the fundamental truth of that harm. All I could do was carry it forward, this weight of knowing what I'd taken and could never return, and try to live what remained of my life without taking anything else from anyone ever again.